Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed the lunchtime, and now it's food for thought shared by our distinguished experts. I'm really happy and delighted to welcome the distinguished scholars and experts, as well advisors, Professor Monika Sus, Professor Magdalena Góra, Professor Leszek Jesień. Well, let me start with a short rationale behind this expert panels. You know that the EU, especially the Council and the work of the Council, is under rotating chairmanship, under rotating presidency. And the next semester, the first semester of 2025, will be Polish semester in the EU. Well, we know that the current situation in Europe and the current states of the European Union is peculiar, and the times is really special. It was an idea to organize such an experts panel and to invite distinguished speakers, experts to talk about security in Europe, in the European Union in particular, in these special times. And I'm really glad and happy that my invitation directed to the present experts was accepted. The fourth expert, Dr. Filip Tereszkiewicz, unfortunately couldn't come because of illness. He just got sick, and he apologized that he is not in a position to come to Kraków and take part in this debate. Let me start with a short presentation of our speakers. Professor Monika Sus is Associate Professor at the Institute of Political Science of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Moreover, or mostly, she's visiting professor at the Center for International Security at the Heuser School in Berlin, and visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence, actually, Badia Fislana. She has done a lot of research in European Union's foreign security and defense policy, and in the institutional dynamics between the supranational and national levels in the EU's foreign policy making. She has received numerous grants from the European Commission, Polish National Science Center, the Polish-German Academic Foundation, and she has published in a variety of top scientific journals, including, just to give a few examples, Contemporary Security Policy, Geopolitics, Journal of European Integration, Journal of Common Market Studies, British Journal of Political and International Relations. She also co-edited volumes published by Routledge and Nomos Verlag. Magdalena Góra, my dear colleague from the faculty, is Associate Professor at the Institute of European Studies of Jagiellonian University, focusing her research on democracy challenges in the European Union, but also the external relations of the EU and democratic practices in the EU's close neighborhood. She has been the leader of numerous an investigator in numerous research projects funded by the Polish National Science Center in the European Commission, mostly Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. She has published extensively on the European Union in such journals of European Security, East European Politics and Society, Cambridge Review of International Affairs, and contributed to edited volumes published by Oxford University Press, Springer, Routledge. Professor Leszek Jesień is the director of the Department of International Cooperation in the Polish Energy Grid Company, and one of the most outstanding experts on the EU's energy policy and security. Previously, he was an associate professor at the Collegium Civitas University in Warsaw and the head of the Institute of International Relations and Sustainable Development. He worked as an analyst for the Polish Institute of International Affairs, coordinating the EU program, and lectured at the Polish School of Public Administration. He served as the advisor to 3 Polish prime ministers, the chief negotiator of Poland's accession to the EU, a minister for European affairs, and some other ministers as well. He's author of numerous books and articles on EU energy, Poland's foreign policy, and on presidency in the EU. Actually, a monographic book on the presidency was published in 2010, and this is still one of the canonic book when it comes to the institution of the presidency in the EU. Thank you for once more for accepting this invitation, and let me just outline the formula of this debate. Well, we'll start with 3 questions for discussion. I mean, I will try to somehow incentivize and invigorate discussion among the experts by asking some questions. And then there will be time for you, dear participants, for the question and answers session and for comments as well. I'm sure, I'm absolutely convinced that the exchange between the experts will be really inspiring. Okay, so my first question concerns the current state of affairs. Okay, especially on the eve of the inauguration of the new European Commission. Actually, there's a second von der Leyen Commission. Interestingly, political guidelines for the next European Commission are already announced, were published. Interestingly, they contain a list of, I would say, existential topics and existential challenges, making the EU and its member states prepare for an uncertain and largely unpredictable future, and tasking the key EU institutions to navigate the EU on this stranger tides. My question is, how does this current situation, this opening balance for the EU and its institutions, as well as for the coming Polish presidency in the Council, look like? Because we are focusing on security in various dimensions and aspects, because my question concerns most institutions. So let me start with Professor Magda Góra, with your reflection on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the panel. I will try to share some early thoughts, and I'm really glad that I'm first commenting on the Commission, because I think there's going to be a lot of interconnections between the reflections here. So I'll start with, I think we need to take the new Commission and its leadership in a context of what happened at the end of the previous term in office, how the campaign worked, what kind of political puzzle we have at the moment in both member states, but particularly in the European Parliament, and how Ursula von der Leyen is going to navigate this domestic or internal connections. I think it was very interesting to follow her focus on security, not only after the Russian full-fledged aggression on Ukraine in 2022, even though to many students of European integration, the early reactions of the leaders, including von der Leyen and Charles Michel, were actually a surprise, right? I don't think that many people really expected the firm and very sort of decisive stance at the EU, and it was to some extent revolutionary, if you wish, in a sense of bringing a very new paradigm to how we look at the EU institutions, which were usually perceived as, you know, slow working and thinking everything over 10 times and then returning and, you know, There is even the infamous among the EU students account on Twitter, the EU is very concerned. Is that the name, I think? So, which posts like every time EU claims it's very or gravely or any other way concerned about the situation, right? This was really very outstanding. And of course, those who looked into the EU affairs knew that there is a change, and that change actually goes at least up to the Brexit negotiations. Scholars confirmed during the Brexit negotiations that, again, against the expectations of many experts, EU kept a very unified front. And that unity built then, in a very different context and a very different, similarly difficult negotiations in terms of the differences in the member states' preferences, possibly built a new atmosphere. Monica, I'm looking at you because I think you speak about it a little bit more in the sense of from where this unity comes. But that decision was unexpected. But then von der Leyen, member states, Charles Michel, and other politicians at the EU level are actually facing a problem how to deal with the promises that were given and how to deliver what was already set in promise in 2022. And I'm thinking not only about the enlargement perspectives, but also about the actual support in military terms for Ukraine. What happened during the campaign before the elections to the European Parliament that I would like to put attention on is the fact that, again, maybe contradictory to what many people expected in Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of leaders actually started to speak out and spell out an actual list of challenges that included the challenges that are coming from very specific actors that were named. And the fact that in many speeches of von der Leyen during the campaign and other politicians, you could hear that the threat is coming from Russian federations and its actions, that the threat is coming or is targeted at the democratic institutions. We all knew it, and all experts were agreeing, but it was actually quite interesting to see how politicians finally started to say about it, right? And again, if you go to look at the confirmations, the speech that von der Leyen delivered seeking the confirmation from the European Parliament of her candidacy in July, she was actually, again, very outspoken, not only in putting who is a threat, where this threat comes, but also what is under the threat. And in that sense, she and Macron were actually in a very interesting debate. Most of you have heard the Macron so-called second Sorbonne speech, in which, again, knowing that politician, we could not expect less, was controversial, right? He said that Europe is Europe could die. I think that's what he said. And then he also defined in a very interesting terms how he sees what Europe is and how he sees what is under the threat. And again, they put this sort of democratic identity or identity defined through democracy as a core of who we are as Europeans and what is at stake at the core of this threat. So what is the target for those who are trying to destroy is actually the way we do the way of life in Europe. And the last document that or sort of instance that I would like to bring in this sense is the strategic Agenda 24-29 that was cooked by Charles Michel just before really the electoral or the elections to the European Parliament happened. And that document, even though it's, again, not that very different from the previous ones, but it does one thing, to me at least, interesting. It puts democracy first. So the document says three things. We need to protect democracy because this is who we are as Europeans, and there are people and actors and politicians and countries that are trying to destroy it because it is, for various reasons, not good for them in terms of the interest to have us, for us to have a vital working democracy. How to protect this democracy and the way of life is strong and secure Europe and prosperity and competitiveness, right? So that is an interesting hierarchy in which, to me, for the first time in a kind of refreshing way, you finally know exactly what needs to be defended. And that, to me, is something that von der Leyen and the class of politicians there did. And I think I'll put it there in terms of the Commission thinking, because a lot of the decisions, how to split portfolios, what to do with the new portfolio of defense, or who's going to be the new commissioner for Mediterranean, what that's going to be, how to locate enlargement. It's all is actually, to me, the way to navigate around this prime goal is to make sure that democracy can be protected. Of course, this sounds very general, right? Protecting democracy and so on. But at least we have the European Democracy Shield that was announced. There's also this vocabulary, right, around democracy that you can sense is, catchy, but stays with this, that it's under the threat. And, a lot of those moves will be to build it. Let's hope, at least I hope, as a Future Democracy Lab coordinator, that it's gonna be successful to protect that democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So from institution to policies and many strategies, because still we have been operating under a kind of conceptual strategic umbrella, right? Professor Monika Sus, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. It's really great to be in Krakow. I feel like I should come more often, so if you have the new lab, please feel free to invite me again. But perhaps before I start talking about, let's say, the more policy-oriented side of things, if I just may pick up two thoughts that Magda started, the one being democracy and the other being the, let's say, the internal dynamic within the European Commission and the institutions. It's actually quite puzzling that we talk a lot about democracy and how to protect democracy during the Hungarian presidency of the Council of the European Union, right? And we see it basically every day that the institutions are struggling because of the presidency, and of course with all the limits the rotating presidency now has, it's still something that complicates the picture and makes the European Union definitely weaker than hopefully it will be the case during the Polish presidency. So let's of course wait until we are on the clock. But for now we have to deal with the challenge coming from the Hungarian side. But also sticking to democracy and moving slowly to the institutional dynamics. You all seen the results of the local but still important elections in Germany on Sunday, right? So this is exactly the threat to democracy that is coming not only in Germany. We have been having troubles looking at France from quite some time, I would say. So we have in the very mainstream of the European Union, we have challenges to the mainstream parties trying to keep the liberal consensus, and this is something the Commission has been facing, of course, over the last couple of years, but will be definitely increasingly facing in the new constellation with the new leaders and with, very turbulent times both in France and in Germany, to say the least. We also have many other countries in Europe that struggle with democratic principles. And I won't mention Hungary again, but we can look basically at every country that is now in the European Union that has strong right-wing or left-wing parties, and we have to take it into account. And it won't make the new term for von der Leyen definitely easier. And this is something that we also have to consider when we think about the new commission, the new constellation. The other question is leadership. So Magda already mentioned that we are now talking in a much more direct language about the threats and the things that the EU should do. It's of course nice to talk, but we have to walk the walk. And for this to happen, we need strong leaders. And again, I assume that you all know that the relationship between the three, let's say, main faces of EU foreign and security policy, namely von der Leyen, Charles Michel, and Joseph Borrell, weren't the best, to say this very diplomatically. Now we have this new opening. We will have new people, and there we will have Kaja Kallas, as we all know. We will have Antonio Costa, and this is a very important question: how they will cooperate with von der Leyen, how von der Leyen will actually allow them to take responsibilities for their portfolios, because as we know, that was one of the challenges for the previous term and for the previous team. And this will again define what the EU will in fact do for the next 5 years. So again, it's very good that we can call threats out and that we can say that, for example, China is our strategic adversary, right? That Russia is an enemy, that we have to defend Europe from Russia. This is something that I would say 4 years ago would not have been possible. Although, I don't know if you remember, but when von der Leyen started the previous, let's say, term, 2019, she was calling for a geopolitical commission or geopolitical European Union. Well, then we have COVID pandemic, and then the war started, or the full-scale war started. So be careful what you wish for, I would say. But now we are not talking anymore about having, geopolitical union or the commission. We know that we have to do this. The question is how we pay for that, to be very brutal, and how, again, we can reconcile this necessity of, bringing more security to Europe with the necessity that Magda was telling about, namely protecting democracy and promoting democracy in the neighborhood. I'm very happy about the EU not having the ambition anymore to promote democracy all over the world. This is a refreshing narrative change. But we have to make sure that countries that are going to become members in the, foreseeable, perhaps not necessarily, but in the future, they stay democracies. And it's difficult if you look at Georgia, for example. So the big question will again be whether the EU has tools not only to protect democracy of its member states, but also of the candidacy countries and neighbors, of course. So I think I will stop now here, because this should be a short intervention, as you said, but I am happy to elaborate more on the security and strategic side in the next question.
Thank you very much. The von der Leyen Commission became famous and controversial because of this, main project focused on the Green Deal and energy. And meanwhile, this energy landscape in Europe has changed completely. So how is your not just opinion, but your reflection on the very idea, very project of Green Deal and how it affects European energy security?
Right. That's for 3 minutes, I guess. Question. No, but seriously, I'm very honored to be here. As I'm not practicing that much academic endeavor these days. I'm paid by the business. But it's been a great pleasure for me, so thanks again. And before I go to the energy, I cannot resist in reacting to the ladies. In a sense, univocal observation that we need to protect Europe and democracy. And then with this angle, we look at the European Commission, right? I'm a little bit old to get that simple, right? Because that pertains to the question what the European Commission is for. And in a classic sense, the European Commission is a servant of the state's governments rather than the savior of the states themselves, not to mention the democracy. But that is a general, of course, very general observation, but very much interesting because I'm not challenging your points. These are the right things because this is the kind of tenure of the discourse as it is now. It's just changed dramatically. In my view, my humble view of a political scientist, democracy is to be protected bottom up rather than top down. But that is, as I said, the non-energy observation. As to the energy, this is an extremely interesting subject that consumes my energies in life for the last number of years. And I would observe the following, that the outgoing Commission has come with a certain response to the energy question, given the framework of the Russian invasion or against Ukraine, with the proposal that we should switch from gas into renewables. That's the kind of most important primary driver of what the previous Commission has said and tried to make afterwards. That is, in technical terms, a very challenging prospect, to say the least, if not impossible in the immediate and medium terms, which is extremely important because in the longer term we can all imagine the beautiful world that everything works and everything is green and proper, clean, but that is not necessarily today, and it's not necessarily the immediate future that it's coming. What we need to, in a sense, draw our attention is a little bit the energy context of the war, if I may do so. The energy context of the war was that the gas prices, and with them the electricity prices in some corners of the world, of Europe, where the electricity prices are coupled with the gas prices, went up tremendously already well before the February 2024, since the summer previous year. Clearly there was a manipulation of the price, especially of the gas, that was largely in the hands of one player, largely through the mistakes of policies that were deliberately chosen. The mistakes were not probably deliberately made, but the policies were deliberately continued in the years to come to 2022, especially on the gas field. The gas was not diversified. The gas was the commodity that we were all more and more dependent from the deliveries from Russia. The manipulation of the economic and energy landscape in particular before the war, in my view, should constitute a kind of tool of war, in a sense, or an element of war that is already to be then extended from, or backwards extended from February 22 into at least summer 21. Now, to cut this long story short, I would argue that the prospect of moving Europe from a world that is gas dependent in energy into the world that is going to rely on renewables is contradicting the terms of feasibility of that prospect, because these days, when we don't have the large-scale storage, both in the short term and medium term, not to say the seasonal terms, and we do not have them not in conceptual terms, because we all know how to make it, technically speaking. We do not have them in commercial and large-scale sense of those quantities of storage being deployed to our households, to our businesses, to the companies, and wherever. Not having them, we simply rely on gas if we want to go along with renewables. The renewables are intermittent. The renewables produce electricity only when there is a sunshine and the wind blows. When there is no sunshine and the wind doesn't blow or stops, there is no electricity, which needs to be replaced by something. Coal generation and nuclear generation does not replace, because it cannot, technically speaking, to follow the the load. I mean, I don't want to go into technical details, but they are not possible. Gas is the commodity and technology that can play this work and they can play this role. But then, by choosing renewables, we continue gas dependency, whether we like it or not, whether we say it or not. It is going to be there. As long as there is large-scale storage, which is not there, and we don't know how long it's going to take us to get there. We don't know whether it's going to take us 10 years or 100 years. And I'm not really extrapolating anything because I don't know. This is a huge technology uncertainty on which we're trying to build the security of our European domestic, economic, and business landscape, on which we are failing. Why we are failing? Because the electricity and energy in Europe is terribly expensive, which drives our businesses out. And the difficulties of businesses in Europe, you may say it's not really relevant for the security or war conference at Jagiellonian University. Of course it is, because the steel is not there. And the steel is necessary for military equipment. And if the steel is going to be green, it's going to be at least 2 to 3 times more expensive as it is now, which is already extremely expensive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, so Europe is in trouble and under pressure. And well, the question is, how can Europe respond? Especially this with geopolitical ambitions, with many defiant powers pressing, sometimes directly attacking by sabotage, disinformation, but also, let's say, this business expansion, etc. So my question to Professor Monikas is, what can the EU do? And how can it cope with these challenges?
Thank you. Well, I mean, the question is certainly not easy to answer because this is something that the EU must do to survive, indeed, I would say. And you mentioned the Macron speech about I think it was about existential threat, right, to the European Union. So maybe a bit more, I don't know, diplomatic again, although Macron is not very diplomatic, as we know. But indeed, I think that the main challenge and the main I won't give you answers. I can just perhaps stick to 5 challenges that I think the EU should deal with in the first place. So the one is obviously security. What does it mean by security? I mean, we all know that von der Leyen, and again, Magda elaborated on that before, put security on top of the list for her new agenda. And this goes also for the European Council, for Council of the European Union, because also these institutions, and you are very right to point out that the Commission is not the end of the world, obviously, also already elaborated on the priorities for the next couple of years. So security means not only investing more in defense, but again, this is a national competence, and this is very important that we all remember that. So the Commission and the institutions, more broadly, European Defence Agency or the EES, can only do as much as the member states actually do for defense. But there is, of course, something the Commission and the institutions can do in terms of incentivizing spending more and better on defense through joint procurement and basically through putting additional money on the table. But again, how we find the money, where we find the money, whether we all agree, for example, to go in depth in order to spend for defense is a very fragile, I would say, consensus. There is no consensus for now, but it will be a very fragile consensus, whatever it is in the end. But there is no agreement so far on how to do it and how to make it happen. And then it's not only about investing and spending, it's also about, developing a reflex to act as a geopolitical actor. And this is something the EU has been talking about for quite some time. We have been making progress. We have new strategic documents, the recent one being the strategic compass that we already know will be updated by the new European institutional team. There will be a white book for Europe for the future of the European defense. That's something that we already also know. It should come in the next 100 years once the European institutions start their activities. But again, this is still very nice to have it, but it should be implemented. And again, the implementation boils down to the national level and to the willingness of the member states to deal with that. So security for once, then very much linked with security as enlargement, and I think we'll come back to that perhaps during the part where we talk about the Polish presidency. This is something definitely that the Polish presidency can push. So the enlargement is also not very, I would say. Well, there is a consensus, I would argue, among the member states that the EU should enlarge. But how, when, and which countries should be invited, there is definitely no consensus around that. So there is much to be done both on the side of the EU, I'm talking about institutional reforms, but also obviously on the side of the candidates. And then again, linked with that and staying at the strategic level, we have to rethink partnerships, not only who do we define as partners, but also how do we deal with partnerships. And we know, I would say, for the better part of the last 2 decades that strategic partnerships was a very nice and catchy label, but it definitely was not as effective as we wanted this to be. So the EU has changed the way it looks at partners to more issue-based and more focus-based partnerships, for example, oriented on energy issues or strategic components. But again, there is much to be done there, and we have to make the partnerships transactional. This is the world we are living in, and we have to make it flexible. So we have to be able to end a partnership that is not longer a partnership. And not a long time ago, Russia was still defined as a strategic partner to the EU, and China for that matter as well. So there has to be this willingness and the readiness of both the institutions and the member states to react to that. And then the fourth and almost final point is, of course, climate change. I won't spend much time on that because you have an expert on energy, so definitely a much more competent person to talk about this than me. But again, we all know that we can't ignore that. And especially if you look at the opinion polls among young Europeans, of course they find security and the war in Ukraine super important, but they equally important find the climate change implications, right? And the mitigation of climate change. And this brings me to the fifth and last point, and we have to somehow combine this all together. So we have to basically square the circle with, security needs that we need to spend more, we need to spend better. At the same time, we need to try to stay competitive as an economic power, because this is where the money comes from, but also what matters, of course, most for stability of the nation state and of our citizens. So again, the list is long, and I could go on and on, but I am guessing that my co-panelists would continue on the list, or perhaps, contradict me on that. But there is something that, all these things are definitely very well known by the new administration of the EU. They're also very well known by all of the member states. The question is how fast we move with that, and what the priorities will be among all these things that I mentioned.
Thank you very much. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 just got the EU in a sort of ambush when it comes to energy. And, the EU just reached out to some, could say, unorthodox solution, and apparently they worked. So is it just looking forward, is it, let's say, right solution, or the situation is safe? Is it just a question of keeping up to something that was already implemented, or it's not really enough? It's something more must be invented or just implemented. How do you say, Professor Leszek?
That's a question, in a sense, to the way the advisors work. Sometimes they pronounce long lists of advisors to follow. Sometimes they are structured, sometimes not. I would answer in a different, from a different camp of advisors with one word: which is nuclear. And this is not a war context nuclear, but energy context nuclear. That brings me back to anecdote, if you allow me, a short one, hopefully. I talked to not that young lady, a Danish lady in Copenhagen, and we talked about the energy issues. And she looked, and that was 2023 and last year. And then when we talked nuclear, she said that there's out of the windows of the building in Copenhagen, there's a site where there was supposed to be a nuclear power plant on the Swedish side construed, which was blocked at her young years when she protested herself against this building of a nuclear power plant in Sweden. And ultimately, this particular plant was not built, although Sweden does have a number of nuclear power generators, while Denmark, as we know, they don't. And I asked her whether in 2023, this picture that we were looking out of the window of the nuclear power plant, not built in Sweden, has changed for her, and she said yes, the power plant should be built now. That is an individual reaction, doesn't change to a public opinion change of Denmark, but it does change the public opinion in Sweden, and Sweden has changed its trajectory of nuclear power building from decommissioning into building new units. This is stable, it's dispatchable, so it works at the will of people, not the weather dependent, and it's climate friendly in a sense of non-emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases in general. So this is my advice.
Okay, thank you. And well, now to the security of democracy, because Professor Magda Góra just focused on the matters concerning, say, the democracy and the democratic governance in the EU. So how are prospects for democratic security in the EU, or how different should be somehow made robust or resilient to all these threats and pressures coming from different parts? We're taking into consideration recent elections in some countries in the EU, so it's a real dilemma.
Thank you for the question, and again, the answer is not easy. But I'll start with democracy, but I'll move later, if I have time, and a little bit towards challenges as well. On democracy, you've mentioned that to defend democracy, it should be bottom-up rather than top-down, but we also know very clearly that the threat for democracy today comes mostly from top-down, and in many instances, I think one of my colleagues who works on a crisis of democracy since the 70s always warns us, saying like, beware of falling into the trap that you always see the crisis of democracy. Think about it. Is it worse now or better than in the 70s for you, young lady? Directing this to me, right? Indicating that for women, for instance, democracy today is much better, even if we understand it's still under threat, it's in a crisis. So there is a sobering, I understand the sobering effect is that, you know, there is a kind of a trap, intellectual trap, if we see democracy in crisis and then we don't see really that it also is fairly resilient itself, right, to answer and improve itself. I think what the European leaders are primarily concerned is that, and they are speaking this out loud, which again was already said, is that it is under the threat of specific actors and it is a target. of their actions, right? That they don't like certain democratic procedures or certain resilient characteristics of democracy for various reasons. And again, it's different reasons for those adversaries that are closer and those that are, for instance, like China further, right? That there is different motivations for why they are not interested in it. I'm not even gonna talk about how to protect democracy as such, but what are the challenges there when it comes to the sort of EU level? And I think, Monica, you've mentioned several times the word consensus. And I think for the discussion about the security threats and challenges in contemporary Europe, again, if we look from the internal perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges is still the growing contestation of consensus or consensuses on certain issues in Europe, whether they are homegrown or they are inspired externally. That doesn't matter in the end of the day, but what matters is that they are making every effort more difficult. You've mentioned money, and again, most of you probably heard a fairly famous interview of Macron when he was trying to convince his citizens to the fact that the peace dividend is over. You just need to spend more money on defense, and that money will go from places where you would like to see it, right? This is really difficult, and it's gonna be difficult to convince everybody. To this simple point, we cannot afford anymore using money for better life. We just need to use this money that we have for making the fact that we survive. This is very awful truth for citizens. And this is gonna be massive fight, because what we start on the EU level is the multi-annual framework, financial framework, right? Negotiations. I mean, they are ongoing, but they're gonna be heated up or speeded up very soon. And even though, of course, again, the EU spendings on those issues are limited, there is a discussion about the additional funding, like the sort of copy-pasting the Next Generation EU mechanism to finance defense. But it's also gonna be a heated debate sort of on several levels between the frugal states and those that want more money, between those who want enlargement and sort of sharing some of this sum with the candidates and their needs and their security, and those that are inside the bloc. But it's also gonna be on the level between the citizens and the government, right? It's gonna be discussion, and it's gonna be everywhere, and its ends. I don't want to say this is the one reason. It's one of the reasons of this sort of fueling the populist wave is this, sometimes not framed clearly this way, but sort of pushing this there. So that contestation, in a sense of, it's gonna have different views. It's gonna be, again, probably quite nasty debates about the enlargements as well in many countries, including the country we are in, which is one of the strongest proponents. We cannot expect, we saw it already, that when you come to discuss the issues of access of food produce or some other actual costs for actual social groups, there's gonna be a nasty discussions on this end, difficult choices for the governments. The last point, and the challenge that I would like to point is that if we want to achieve many of those things, the institutions and many leaders in national capitals think that we need to reform ourselves as the union, that the union that we have at the moment, no matter whether we're gonna see it more intergovernmentally, more federalizing, but the one that we have at the moment is not fit to do it. We need to change it. And that discussion is gonna open another massive, to me, and again, fairly ugly front of discussions who's for and against and for what. And there are several challenges there. The one challenge is how to do it. Some countries, Germany, France, or at least some political actors and social and experts in those countries are saying we need to have a treaty change. Some other capitals are against it, but also some experts are saying, do you want a treaty change in a landscape in which actually the groups that are sovereignists, that want to repatriate the competences from European Commission, European Parliament, even to some extent Council, are actually really significant. I mean, of course, there are 3 groups in the European Parliament, but if you calculate how many seats they have altogether, this is really fairly, loud voice, right? And they differ on almost everything, but they're all sovereignist. So when it comes to the treaty change, they would actually have a potential to unify in their views on how to do it. So, so how to do this reform and where to find the consensus on what exactly to reform and how to do it. We know that they are, this is more maybe technical. We can add some of those reforms to the first accession treaty. Would that be Montenegro? Probably wouldn't hurt EU, right? Given the asymmetry in potential. If you take a fairly small country, accelerate the enlargement process, bring it, you have accession treaty, you can put some of the reforms there, change it. But all of this is going to open a discussion what kind of project we want, whether to federalize, not federalize, stay as it is. Just an anecdote from our research on the Future of Europe debate. One of the most often stated issues when it comes to the future of Europe was to leave the status quo when it comes to the EUFS. So political actors in most of the countries that we research, coming from very different party groups, located differently on political spectrum, say, just leave it as it is, just fix the policies, do something, don't change the treaties, don't get into this discussion, who has more competences. You already mentioned the not so nice relations between only 3 of those leaders, right? On top of the EU institutions, there is much more of this interinstitutional battles and fights. They're not gonna go away, even if we have a new set of people who might like each other more than the previous set. We don't even know actually how they're gonna relate to each other. But the point is that before enlargement, before building union as a geopolitical actor, some of this discussion needs to be fixed in some way, right? And that's gonna be long, and again, probably a Twitter account. EU is gravely concerned about the internal problem will emerge soon.
Okay, so let's now go to the incoming Polish presidency. And so my question, which is matter for your consideration, is what are your recommendations, or what the Polish government should do or could do while holding presidency in the council, and what is achievable, what is doable for the Polish presidency? And let me start with Professor Leszek Jesień, expert and experienced advisor when it comes to Malta's presidency. And also, as I said, the author of a brilliant book on this institution. Please.
No, and the button. The button is essential. This is a red button on top of it. I would follow a great example of Professor Heuser of today, and just follow on Professor Zgóra's the intention to reform the treaties. And I would ask the audience who would be in favor of changing the treaty. Let's simplify one treaty. And it's not distinguished between the TU and functioning of the European Union. So I would ask the question, who would be for and who would be against reforming of the EU fundamental treaties? Who is of the audience in favor of reforming the treaties now? 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. And who would be against reforming the EU treaties now? 2, 4, 6, 7. Myself, I would firmly vote against reforming the EU treaties, and yourself as well. What about the chair?
Okay, yes.
You would abstain.
Yes, no.
Right. This is an interesting line of reasoning. The European Union is not fit for a number of things, but if we decide now on changing the treaties, then it's definitely taking the energies and attention of both the politics and the general public at the time which we don't have the time. And I would strongly disadvise going along this path. Having written extensively also on the flexibility in European integration and hence cooperations and the things that can be used very much instead of looking at the European Commission only and the agreement between 27 or 28 if we counted Britain not so long ago. I was always puzzled by the effect of one or two countries blocking, for example, assistance to Ukraine these days. Right? If we want to give money to Ukraine, what stops us from doing that in the company of 25 or 26, if the 27 is not possible? It's the laziness of the political life, because we do know that there is a commission which could have the power. There is a money there in the European budget, probably not enough, but still there, so we could draw on the assets institutionally and financially. This is simply a laziness, intellectual laziness. If we want to help Ukraine, we could help Ukraine within the given framework as it is, as it stands. It's a matter of political will among the agreeing parties, that is for sure. Now, for what the European, what the Commission could do, for what the presidency could do, the Polish presidency, I would remain narrow in my understanding of in my concentration and understanding of the European energy policies, and I would argue that the presidency of a country that wants to build the nuclear power plant should proceed with the all sorts of lobbying as it is possible within the council to argue that this is the right track to secure the climate-friendly energy generation, and that is a clear one. Now. The EU presidency is something that is particularly difficult to argue in general, because it gets down to the sectorial sittings of the council that tend to be compartmental and then isolated from each other, with the exception of certain councils that have the cross-cutting competences and overseeing, like environment, finance, economy. There is so I have a difficulty in arguing in this non-energy concentrated public that the EU Energy Council should strive under the Polish presidency to change the general paradigm of the electricity market's operation in Europe, because it's a bad one. It is based on the principle of copper plate. I need to be technical, where the prices are equal from Rzeszów to Katowice to Szczecin and Gdańsk, to use just one example of one bidding zone, which is because in the electricity language it is called a bidding zone. And there is, if we are in the old world of stable power generation, there is no problem, and we could have lived with that picture for dozens of years or whatever. But if we move into the world of renewables and a growing number of renewables in the system, as we do have in this country and in the other countries, and this is an only natural thing that there will be a growing number of generating points across the country. There is no philosophical and technical reason why a price of electricity in Kraków could not differ from the price of electricity in Niepołomice, for example, which would only give the right incentives for investment across the whole country. But in order to do so, we would need to change the whole paradigm on which the electricity markets are based, and we would need to go away from the copper plates principle into what is called the nodal system, based on locational marginal pricing. This is not a moonlight reasoning. There are countries which happily work on that, the United States, Australia, unfortunately also Russia, unfortunately because the example is not to be taken, but they also have this kind of system. It's a rational choice. And that needs to be worked out at the level of the European Union, because one country cannot really, and that's highly technical why, but it cannot really, I can spend an hour on that, if need be, but it's impossible to have an isolated country within the European Union and within the single internal market on electricity as a commodity, to have a different paradigm on which this whole thing is based. So, two things for the Polish presidency: nuclear and electricity market organization. Thank you.
Good. Now, Professor Góra, Magda, what are your tips for Polish presidency?
Well, I think there is an important timing factor in how Poland will take presidency. You've mentioned already the Hungarian presidency, which we know is sort of put a little bit down. One of the commentators, I think it was Alemano, commented that we had the empty chair crisis, now we have a low chair approach, so basically lowering the level of many of the initiatives as a way to kind of harness the impact of Hungarian presidency. But what it actually means for the political cycle is that the Polish presidency will be the one when really things started to be done. Because we are in between the institutional, of course, the things are going on, right, as in every political systems, but we know that there is gonna be the kind of new energy coming. We also know from, I think, today or yesterday that there's planned already a delay in appointing the commissioners, so it means also the delay in the confirmation procedure in the European Parliament, which altogether means that when Poland will take the lead, it's going to actually fall into the important 100 days. You've mentioned the 100 days for the white paper on defense. It's basically, I think, for the European Commission, European Affairs, the 100 days principle works as much as it works for every new government. What it means is that the Polish presidency should primarily focus on being a facilitator of a consensus of those who want healthy and sort of vibrant European integration. They need to stand as leaders in many sectoral formats, right, and contexts, but actually to start to play the game, to put member states together, build consensus, push things, because one thing that we don't have is time. And I think that's the priority. No matter what they say, it's security and security and security. Yes, all of this, right. But in principle, it's let's make things rolling. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. And what's your recommendation? Or what are, in plural, I think?
Well, first of all, I very much agree with Magda on the timing. That is actually quite good for the Polish presidency, I would say, because we really can make difference in terms of pushing things forward. And I also very much agree, and I will link this to perhaps a few recommendations indeed for the Polish presidency with Professor Jesień elaborations on the treaty and on the flexibility mechanisms and on differentiated cooperation. We can call it as we want because there are many names basically for similar phenomena. But the treaty or the treaties that we have actually allow us to differentiate and to move forward among a small group of countries. And Poland could also be as you know, as someone holding presidency, a country that initiates or continues to initiate important projects. I just want to remember, perhaps to remind you about a very good document that I feel somehow was not very, I mean, perhaps not enough observed by the Polish press. I mean, the Weimar Declaration on Security and Defense, published in May, I believe. There were turbulences in France, there were many things happening in Poland, but this is actually, in my view, for the very first time, something very tangible coming from the Weimar Triangle. We can discuss whether this format is effective at all or whether we should skip it altogether, but this is a very concrete set of priorities of the three countries, how to move forward with security and defense at the European Union. So I expect Warsaw to move on things like that with partners, not necessarily only France and Germany, but also with other countries when the priorities align. A similar document or a similar kind wasn't disclosed in fully, but Radosław Sikorski elaborated on that a couple of times. There was a non-paper presented by him at one of the recent Foreign Affairs Council on how to make the transatlantic relationship better. So basically, in case we have Trump in the White House from January onwards, how to nonetheless, because we have to work with the United States in this situation. So in these topics, definitely we can move. And I mentioned enlargement before. I would definitely repeat that Poland can be, again, a country pushing for keeping the pace, for opening negotiations with many countries. And perhaps the last and final thing that I already said somewhere, so I hope that I'm not repeating myself too much, but it's about EU and NATO. Again, we have beautiful declarations, and we have, to some extent, definitely also willingness coming from both institutions and organizations to work together. But what we really need now is not another declaration, but it's an implementation plan. And NATO actually elaborated on that during the recent summit, not in the final statement of the summit, but let's say in the talks around the summit. And also the European Commission and von der Leyen also mentioned that we now need to renew basically the implementation of these declarations and make the EU-NATO declaration, the EU-NATO partnership much more effective. And Poland seems to be the perfect country to move with that forward for many reasons we can then discuss perhaps in the Q&A if you want.
Thank you very much for your ideas that you just presented to the public. So now it's time for sort of revenge. I'm just opening the floor for questions from the audience, and I see Kamil raising his hand.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So at the very end of that fascinating discussion, American elections were mentioned. And indeed, Polish presidency of the EU will coincide with the new US administration. The question is, and I invite any of the speakers to contribute on this. The question is, in the European Union and in Europe more broadly, have we moved beyond that kind of truism where we say Donald Trump is a threat to the transatlantic relationship, transatlantic alliance, and Europe has to get its act together? Because there is no excuse. We could say that in 2016, we could say that in 2018, we are in 2024, and there is a realistic prospect of another Trump presidency. Has Europe drawn sufficient conclusions from the first term of Donald Trump and from the prospect of another 4 years of that administration? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamil. I think that we can collect more questions and then ask all panelists to answer. I see Agata, yes?
Thank you very much for very, very interesting interventions. And I wanted to ask something that came up several times, but I'm going to use Professor Su's words. And you said that there is a consensus about the enlargement, right? So the enlargement has to happen. The question is how and when and who, and there is no consensus about that. And the thing that I'm wondering about, and I don't expect you to give me like a full answer because I know this question is way too complicated. But I'm wondering, how do we strike a balance between, having those candidate countries meet the criteria and the conditions and being suitable for joining the EU on the one hand, and on the other hand of not having those countries somehow disillusioned or feeling deceived in a way that they are trying and still we say, well, another list of conditions. Do it while there is a war on your territory. How do we strike the balance between these two things? Thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice, please.
Thank you very much. And I think there is a perfectly good answer even to the last question, but I'd like to have the panel's idea about this. In the 1990s, some of those of us who are very old remember very well that there was a debate about widening and deepening. And there seemed to be a particularly interesting compromise, which was to say, well, there should be a hardcore Europe, and there should be an association of other countries that are not as deeply integrated. There was a famous paper that came from the German Conservative Party, the Schäuble-Lammers paper in the 1990s, and I think that there is a very good argument to be made that there are countries in Europe that are more like-minded and more interested in deepening than others, and others who are much more distant from that. So first of all, my question is, and this is precisely the reform that I would very much like. At the moment, the trend seems to be, or the fashion seems to be, minilaterals and associations of the willing, rather than anything that is put in cement that has actually made a proper change in the constitution. My problem with minilaterals is that they're very unreliable. They're very transitional. They go, they come. We happen to have a consensus on this. Let's do this today. Oh, new government. Oh, all gone. Is this something that should be revived? The idea of a hardcore Europe and then a looser confederation. And then my question would be. From everything you've said, you could see Poland, for example, in a hardcore defense Europe. Would you still want to see something that would be multifaceted, so it would be of varied configuration, as we used to say, or a multi-configuration thing, where you'd have in one area more cooperation between those countries, another area more cooperation between those countries? Would it be a multifaceted variable geometry? Used to be the 1990s expression for that. Thank you. And where would Poland stand?
Thank you. Well, I think that now we can respond to the question that were posed, and then we'll give opportunity to more questions. So perhaps starting with Professor Monika Sus.
Thank you so much. It's good to start because I know that you both will pick everything else up, right? So I can just maybe start us off. So to Kamil, to the first question, it's funny that you mentioned this because I think it's a podcast from today or yesterday with Anne Applebaum being interviewed about her recent book. And among others, there is one question regarding the future of the US-Europe relationship. And she seems to be fairly confident that even if Trump gets elected, Europe will hold together. So I wish I had her optimism. I don't share this view fully. I wish, of course, that Europe will then would hold its act together. But to be honest, I'm not so sure. So I don't think that, answering your question directly, I don't think that we draw enough lessons from the first Trump presidency, especially because we already know that if we should have a second Trump presidency, it will be a definitely different presidency than the first one. And we basically have evidence for that already, looking at the preparations of his team and, well, the whole community, let's say. But then again, I'm actually curious what the both co-panelists would like to add to that, because sometimes when I talk to people from the Polish government, of course this is not on record, but they can tell you, and they actually told me that sometimes they wish that Trump wins, because it makes them to some extent certain that countries of Western Europe will continue to spend enough on defense. So this is a tricky explanation, but to some extent I can understand the logic. But this also shows that there is definitely, I wouldn't say there's a united front among the European countries what to do if Trump should win, and if Trump should decide to withdraw the support for Ukraine. I am not talking about withdrawing from NATO. There are other, I think, things to be worried about, but at least withdrawing support or diminishing support for Ukraine would, of course, change the situation completely for not only Ukraine, but also obviously for Europe. About striking the balance between conditionality and, well, effective enlargement, super difficult question, to be honest. I don't have an answer to that, but I can just say that we already failed many countries. I mean, if you go to Montenegro and talk to people there, well, they can tell you stories how the EU, continued basically not to hold to their promises, but at the same time we know that we have to find a solution. And actually, I could link this to the next question with the variable geometry. I also sometimes think, but again, as a researcher, so I'm in the comfortable position not to be an advisor. I can just research these things, and there is definitely room for maneuver if we are talking about variable geometry and concentric circles of integration. So probably, if you ask my personal opinion, this would be the only way to go, and for me. And then, of course, we can talk about. Well, staged accession is, of course, something that is also on the table, and it was. I think put for the first time in the recent, let's say, history of the European Union by a think tank, by CEPS, and the staged accession would basically mean, in this very concrete case, that we would, for example, integrate Ukraine into defense, into the single market, including defense, but leave out other, well, things that go together with accession. So this could be a solution, but how we do it, it's again another question that luckily the academics perhaps don't have to worry too much. And I think I'll stop here because there are other questions, but I'm sure that you can answer them more competently than me.
Thank you, Magda.
Thank you very much. These are great questions. I'll start from the last one on widening and deepening and differentiated integration. And I'll start with the fact that it is a returning solution that never works. I mean, it works sometimes, somewhere, for some time, but that usually not. And we've done a comparative research asking political actors, or actually analyzing, decoding political actor statements, several thousand of those in 12 countries, what they think about differentiated integration. Differentiated integration is not perceived as a solution to most of those problems. Maybe in France and Germany and the report Sailing the High Seas, when they are returning to the idea, oh, core Europe, or let's those who want more integrate more. But in fact, it doesn't work. And it won't work for many reasons, but there is a normative reason there that, as you actually rightly pointed, in the end of the day, you never know who's gonna go out from those solutions. And one of the key sort of victims of this differentiated integration approaches is actually, and for some reasons we are doing the circle, is actually a democracy imprinted in at least some of the procedures on the European level. And if you don't have everybody on board, you really have a problem with this. And again, why the political actors in Poland, Sweden, Denmark, and Slovakia actually, regardless of their political affiliations, reject these solutions? It's because this is peripheralizing them. And they see this threat similarly whether they are in Poland or in Sweden or Slovakia. Given the different sort of circumstances, economic, belonging to Euro and not belonging, and other aspects. So these can be solutions for some areas for short time, but in the long run, this is not going to work for the European Union. So, and that brings me to the first question about why are we not prepared? Because here I agree with you. Perhaps because we could not be, in the sense that, what do we really want Europe to be prepared to the fact that one of our closest allies go rogue? Like what this means? It means that we do together stuff that is now under the intergovernmental, transgovernmental regimes, right? Which means that we should have a federation, right? In some form, in some of those areas, to be able to react as fast as in, you know, efficient political system. We are not having this, and we are probably won't for this reason, which goes back to the discussion about the future of Europe, you know, the treaty reforms and so on and so forth, right? We cannot, this is a capability expectation gap, again, drafted in the early 90s. You cannot expect from the European Union to deliver you something that you're not equipped it to deliver in the first place in the areas of security, defense, and so on. So, you know, it cannot do that, right? So don't put your expectations. In the end, to me, you know, this is a more fundamental question about the political system and the reforms we are pushing it towards, or the infamous, in the end of the day, finalité politique, right, which we still don't know what it is, to answer us the questions why we're not ready. And of course, there is another discussion to be held in a sense of like, you know, what is possible solutions, how we can maneuver around it, what can be done to be prepared for this, you know, sailing the high seas, or as Blockman said, you know, the non-good weather conditions EU needs to operate. But in fundamental point is, I think this is about this, you know, unfinished integration, if you wish. And that brings me to the middle questions about the candidates. And yes, it is. We keep them in purgatory. And that's not easy for anybody to be there, right? Most likely. What are the solutions? I fully agree. The ones, and of course, we cannot, again, speed up the accession for the reasons that if you talk to, as a proponent of enlargement, to any audience that includes people from old, so-called, or the oldest member states, the immediate question comes, what are we gonna do if we're gonna have another Hungary or Poland? I mean, previous Poland. In other words, the first reflex is how to make sure that enlargement will not destroy the project from inside, bringing countries that can go the, you know, rule of law crisis all over again. And everybody knows how this weakens European Union, right? You started with comments on Hungary, and I think this is very true. Point is that this fundamentally weakens European Union if you have member states that are really going against the shared values. So how to do it? It's not easy. So we cannot speed up the process for the fact to be effective. The one option is effective policy regimes that can give as many incentives as possible to those countries. And the second, which is again a little bit more normative, is allow them and build the channels of communications that are limiting as much as possible the asymmetry of relations in which we as European Union decide conditions, and they are in a position, take it or go, right? It's difficult to imagine even how to build it, but if you would give them more partnership position in co-negotiating at least, this would make that uncomfortable position better. Whether that's gonna happen, I'm very skeptical. Thanks.
I fully share the last sentence of skepticism, unfortunately. And all the rest, by the way, as well. But yes, starting from where Professor Góra has ended, I had a pleasure to advising Jan Kłakowski, the late Jan Kłakowski, who was the chief negotiator of accession, of our accession to the European Union at the times of Jerzy Buzek as prime minister, and you know that not to disillusion the candidate country, there is only one way to make them the EU member. No other thing matters. No partnership matters. No special privilege relationship matters. Now, if we say that this is impossible, that the ultimate conclusion is that they are not going to be the members and they are going to be disillusioned. And they would go the other way around. That means that we need to use the opportunities in order to do things. One of my friends in the European Commission at the time, she said to me that if there is a window of opportunity that you could join the European Union, just join them, because otherwise you might not. And then at that time, I felt that this is kind of implicit pressure on me and on my friends in Warsaw that we should skip aside certain sensitivities, the free movement of labor, of free movement of capital, real estate acquisition, all this stuff that was important at the time, in order to accept the membership on their condition. That is the logic of a candidate country that I'm trying to reveal now. But that was true. With the 2007 acceptance of Romania and Bulgaria, the window of opportunity closed. And honestly, today, I do not believe that any of other enlargements would happen under the current setting. I was of an opinion, I had different things to do at the time, that if we thought of a new window of opportunity for Ukraine, it should have been used in 2022. Now it's closed. Why and how it could be done? It could have been done if we thought it is something in our interest, because you could have a political membership without membership to the policies, right? Which is a kind of empty shell membership, but it's not true, because it gives an asset of membership in voting rights and probably the budgets and some other little things. But then if we imagine the other way around, the membership after 30 years, that is probably the ultimate result on equal terms, because if we accept the empty shell now with the 30 years of transitional period, the end result is the same. But we need to use the windows of opportunities, and if we don't, then there are consequences. And there are consequences for Turkey, because they are going the other way around. That's consequences for the Balkans, Western Balkans, and there will be consequences for Ukraine. Now, one thing on the deepening and widening and the hardcore, as it used to be called at that time, of variable geometry. This whole debate is really from the 1990s. I had the pleasure to participate to a research that was at the time done with the Secretary General, the department of the French government, and the Germans included in the I recall the dates, that was 1997 to 1998, which is old times really. And we tried to figure out whether we could have the real opportunities within the given treaty framework. And the conclusion was that it's very, very limited. So the other conclusion, so to speak, is that flexibility, really as it is, stands outside of the treaty framework, on the coalition of the willing, be it in any area, with dire consequences for the institutions, because we are used to have the all-powerful European Commission. We used to have the Council of the European Union, where we have the ministers to meet. And this cozy framework would need to be left aside and join the normal operation. I underline a normal operation of a normal nation state in Europe. They get together to do things together. If they don't, tant pis. Yeah? There's no other choice. So if we are kind of locked into the institutional framework and treaty framework of the European Union because it's a useful one. We do have the Commission, which is a useful thing to have because they can provide us with an agenda and possible solutions to the problem, then we can disagree with that. And that's a fantastically cozy environment. Intellectual laziness, it is behind that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have time for one or maximum two questions. Yeah, I see. Bismillah.
The mic is here.
Yeah, please.
Use it.
So it's a opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. It was very useful information from all speakers. I have one question. In the other side of security, especially the human security, in the terrorism and extreme wrong, right wing in Europe, what's the main challenge for EU security in the current situation? It is right-wing extremism or jihadism. If it is, when we look into the number of activity, especially the terrorist activity, mostly it's coming from the right-wing, extreme right-wing activities. But why the reaction of the community and media is very high to the activity of jihadism people in the Europe? And second questions, both of you mentioned about the democracy and concern of democracy in the Europe. It means when we protect the democracy, it means we protected the security also. If we have a democracy, it means we have security also or not. It's two separate subjects. We can have democracy. We can have security without democracy. Or we cannot have security without democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? All right, so yeah, that's a really big question raised by Ms. Mulaktaban. And yeah, I would like to ask you for really concise answers, if possible.
Why did you give the mic in the other direction to Magda?
Yeah, expert on.
Well, no, I'll take them, but I'll give it to my co-panelists as well. I think it just all starts coming back to me because I actually started my book on contestation in foreign policy from Bauman's observation. How do we really navigate between the sort of security and democracy in the sense that they're not necessarily complementary as such. So this all flashing back now, but I have probably 1 minute to say, and I think my conclusion to the challenge on this is that one of the key, and again, I'll use Macron for answering your question, is that I understand what he was trying to deliver in a couple of recent interventions is the sort of discursive and narrative threat that is behind this existential threat for Europe, is that there is a certain way we as Europeans in our tradition, we're linking the security and the limitations for the freedoms of citizens and balancing this with the democracy. And our narrative on this is probably threatened by other narratives that are appearing worldwide that are actually going against it. And I think in his speech in Sorbonne, he's actually pinpointing to this point, is that we are losing as Europeans in the way we produce grand narratives. And one of the core elements of this European grand narrative is to find this sort of balance between, on the one hand, security, and on the other hand, sort of even on democracy. To me, and then he is trying to understand how we can fight back about it. And that's much more difficult for Macron and for all of us in a way to find this ability to narratively respond. I think, well, I'll stop here. No answers to your question, just maybe raising more consent on this.
Yep.
This is, of course, terribly difficult, but I would observe probably two things that I can, as you say, it's difficult to imagine, it is possible to imagine security without democracy, but it's probably not possible to do the other way around, to imagine a democracy without security. Which means, to me, again, I would get back to my other hat as a political scientist, that we need a layer of underlying communication, primordial communication between the segments and individuals in order to make them into a coherent, more or less coherent entity that is this society. Various sociological terms for that, but I don't want to dig into that. The thing is that we run on the assumption of our demo or demoi in Europe for good in a sense of certain specific states. In a number of interventions on the political level, specifically on the narrative that have been just recalled, there is a underlying assumption of a European demos, which is a little bit of a stretch of the word, although it is a little bit of a stretch, which is not an empty notion any longer, which is already something.
One final sentence, if I may. I agree, it's not an empty notion. I would say it's an evolving notion, an evolving demo, of course. And I think that we have been perhaps increasingly starting to realize that there are alternatives that we not necessarily like, but they are there. And I mean, Magda mentioned something about narratives. There is this big notion, or there's this big concept about battles of narratives, right? And indeed, we are now facing the situation where there are countries in the world, for example, China, that can very well imagine to have security without democracy, but not only for itself, but also they want to promote this picture. So I think this is the challenge that Europe broadly, I mean, much more broadly than the European Union, Europe and the Western world is facing now. But great question, thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's time to just wrap up this excellent debate. So let's thank our experts and panelists for very insightful comments and observation on the past, present, and the future of Europe and this incoming Polish presidency. So great, thanks for you. Yeah. All right, and now it's a break in our conference, coffee break. So please take opportunity to enjoy coffee, tea, and drinks. And afterwards, we are splitting into two panel groups. They will be in the first floor in the rooms 141 and 142. There is a program of each panel in each of the rooms, so I think that you will find it, and you can just double check who's in the panel. So I'm warmly inviting you to continue and to participate in the two panels of afternoon. And now, please enjoy the coffee break. Thank you.